I'm just a map collector. I'm not a professional historian or anything like that. I just enjoy maps. And so as a consequence of that, I wanted to make sure I knew what I was collecting. And I've had a lot of fun doing it. So I guess we'll get started. There's probably no better place to start than at the beginning, right? So let's start at the beginning. And so this is the Juan La Cosa map. It's a manuscript map, which means there's only one. It's done on vellum. So that is an animal skin that it is created. All the early maps were done on vellum or animal skins. So this is the earliest representation of what became known as the New World. It wasn't described as the New World early on. From 1500, it was created by Juan de la Cosa, who was Columbus's pilot and Vespucci's pilot, and Juan Ojeda's pilot in 1501. It is the earliest map that shows the New World in existence today. It is a Portolan style map, which means that the main things that they were interested in were the shorelines and how to get from one place to another over the water. The Florida is up there where the yellow arrow is. I think you can barely see Spain right there. Can you see that? The Gibraltar is right there. So Gibraltar on this map and for the next 50 years or so was on the same latitude as the Florida Keys. Obviously, that's not the case, but that's the way it was represented in all these early maps. This illustrates the discoveries of the Cabots, and it is the earliest undisputed representation of what was. So at this point in time, Columbus, everybody thought that this was not the New World. They didn't call it the New World. They thought it was Asia. In fact, Columbus had all the folks on his ship, all of his captains had to sign an affidavit stating that Cuba was not an island, in fact, even though it's shown on this map as an island. There's Cuba right there. But it was part of mainland Asia because that's what he went to find, right? He didn't go to find the New World. He went to find Asia. And remarkably enough, as many people don't know, the closest that Columbus ever got to North America was Cuba. He never set foot on North America. In fact, he may not have been the earliest person to discover America. That was probably Vespucci, who discovered South America, not North America, which was first called the New World. So that is the first map. There's only one. I wish I owned it, but I can't. This is the next map in a series of maps that feature the New World. This is the Ruysch map from 1507. I didn't bring it with me, but I do have this map. He was a Benedictine monk. He actually made a voyage just like Juan de la Cosa did. So these are first-person representations of what he saw. It features the Caribbean islands, Hispaniola. Excuse me. So here's Hispaniola, here's South America, right here. And this is still represented as Asia. This is still Asia. There's Africa. Here's the Straits of Gibraltar to get you guys oriented. This is a world map. It's on a quartiform presentation, which was a little unusual. So at the top of the map is the Arctic, so that's the North Pole right there. Everything obviously revolves around that. So it is the first, so here you can't see it, but this says Mundus Novus. This is the first reference to the fact that what they thought they had found, ultimately what was discovered by certainly Vespucci and maybe Columbus, but certainly Vespucci, was a new world. It was not Asia. And then we go to the Waldseemüller, which is 1507. This is a blow up. This is the first time that you will ever see the word America. And it may have been appropriately ascribed to Amerigo Vespucci, but it is in South America, not North America. No, North America wasn't. Vespucci never set foot in North America. Columbus never set foot in North America. It is based on their discoveries of South America. So this is America, which was considered now to be the fourth part of the world, after Europe and Africa and Asia. And they are all, for all you ladies, they are all feminine gender of the four continents of the world. Waldseemüller named the New World America based on his meetings with Amerigo Vespucci, who credited himself with the discovery. Some people dispute that, so it's a question as to whether or not he did or Columbus did. I think probably it was appropriately ascribed, to Vespucci. This is a woodcut map. I do not own this map. You own this map. There's one copy of this. It's in the Library of Congress. We paid $10 million for this map. It's the most that a map has ever been paid, and it was bought from the German government, and it was ceremoniously conveyed to us, the citizens of the United States, from the German government back in the 90s. So the title of this is the Birth Certificate of the Florida Keys, and that's what it is. This dates from 1511. This map, there are about 10 known copies of this map in existence today. That is one of them. I'm lucky enough to have one. And it is, in fact, the birth certificate of the Florida Keys. So let me orient you a little bit if I can. So here's Cuba. You can see it. It says Cuba right here. This is Hispaniola, which is obviously now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. These are the Bahamas as they were represented at that time, which they only knew the Bahamas as far as Columbus went up the Bahamas, which was probably San Salvador. This is Yucatan, fairly readily represented, Central America, and then South America. Here's Paria here. You'll see that this is the first representation on any map of Bermuda. This is actually shown as the Straits of Gibraltar here. So the map is compressed laterally only by about 3,500 miles, which was the general, or 3,000 miles, which was the general, that was what Columbus thought at the time. So this is the first printed map devoted to the Americas. It is, again, a Portolan style. You'll see there's no detail on the uplands. Everything is associated with the shoreline. There's no latitudes or longitudes. This is called the Isla de Bimini. So the Indians, that's what they referred to Florida as, was the island, was Bimini. The Bahamas are called Los Incayos. Cuba, which you can't really tell from this map, is though at the same latitude as Gibraltar here. It's actually, Gibraltar is well north of Cuba, but it's important to understand that for the purposes of discussion here. So again, guys, if you remember your history, Florida wasn't discovered until 1513. So the question is, how do we have a map from 1511 before Florida was discovered by Ponce de Leon in 1513? It's a great question, which we can only surmise potentially some answers for that. But there were a lot of voyages of discovery to America that weren't recognized, that were kept secret by the governments of Portugal and Spain, because these were all national secrets. This is the reason that there's only 10 of these maps left, is because the Spanish government suppressed this map. When it was published, they they destroyed copies. They made sure that the publisher stopped printing it. And so the reason for that is because the Spanish, who didn't produce any maps, and we'll talk about that as we go on, they didn't produce any maps of Florida for the 250 years that they owned Florida. And because they didn't want anybody to know about Florida. And the Spanish were very, very secretive about their maps. They had what they called the Pardon Real, which was the official map, which was held in Madrid under lock and key, and all the captains who had sponsored trips to the New World would have to bring back information to add to that Pardon Real. There was only one copy. Copies were made from that map by hand, but there were never any printed copies of the Pardon Real. There's no remaining extant copies of it available for any of us to see, unfortunately. So this is a great map. So it is particularly interesting because it shows what you will see in many maps from here on, the Tortugas, which are represented by this circle of islands here. You'll see that in some subsequent maps that we look at. Very distinctive representation of an area, and those are the Tortugas. These are the Florida Keys. This is the first map that would ever show the Florida Keys, and it shows it in more detail at this early stage before Florida was even discovered. So it's quite an interesting map. It's especially interesting for us here because we live here. And it's just a small map. You can see this is the map right here. And it was created by a guy named Peter Martyr. He wrote a magazine effectively called The Decades, which chronicled all of the discoveries of the New World and published that on a regular basis. It was a subscription document printed in Spain. Martyr was in the court of the Spanish, so he had access. He spoke to Columbus. He spoke to Vespucci. He spoke to the Cabots. He actually knew these guys. He relates so let's go back to that question about how we can have a map dated 1511, 2 years before Florida was supposedly discovered. How could we do that? So Peter Martyr, in his chronicle, in his magazine, The Decades, related a conversation that he had with Sebastian Cabot, Sebastian Cabot became the first pilot major for the Spanish. He was in charge of the Pardon Real. The pilot major was the guy who actually made those changes to the state map of Spain about the New World. So he related a conversation that he had with Cabot about Cabot. So there were Sebastian Cabot was the father. His son, his father Sebastian never came back from his second or third voyage. I can never remember. But Sebastian Cabot John Cabot was the one who never came back from the third voyage. So Sebastian related a conversation to Peter Martyr that said that he and his father sailed so far south along the coast of the New World that Cuba was on their left. So obviously that would put them off of Florida. And we'll see a map, the Ferducci map from 1513 and 1514, which was based on Ponce de Leon's voyage of discovery, which was the effective date in 1513 of the discovery of Florida, but obviously it was well known before that. So there is specific evidence that would indicate that Cabot was the one, the Cabot family. And they were Genoese, just like they were Italian. They were in the employ of the English at the time. So it could well be that the English who ended up with most of North America were in fact the first folks who found Florida. So there's lots of other conjecture about who these early folks might have been who helped Martyr draw this map, but the best evidence is from Martyr himself, and it very well could be the Cabots. The next map in our chronology here goes to 1513. So this is Waldseemüller again. So remember, this is Waldseemüller. This is just a section of the 1507 Waldseemüller map, the $10 million map, which names the New World America, the first place it's ever been named America. This is his second map, 1513, and you'll see he's tried to correct what he thinks may have been a mistake and he calls the New World not America anymore. He calls it Terra Incognita. So it's not Asia. So we know it's not Asia by this time because Reich here says it's not Asia. Everybody by that time, by 1507, knew that it wasn't Asia. They knew that they were dealing with the New World. So he calls it Terra Incognita. This is otherwise known as the Admiral's Map. Again, you'll see that the Tropic of Cancer, which is shown here, is below Cuba, and that's important to understand because of the reference to the Cabots and their discussion with Peter Martyr. So you can see here Gibraltar and Cuba are essentially on the same latitude. In this map, Waldseemüller replaces America with Terra Incognita, trying to maybe fix his mistake, which may not have actually been a mistake, because there's still a question as to whether or not Columbus or Vespucci were the first folks to discover not North America, so neither of them did that, but who discovered the mainland of South America. So this map was printed in Strasbourg in France. It's a woodcut again, and it's right over here. That's the Waldseemüller from 1513 right there. That is a copy. There's a few more copies of that than there are the Martyr map, but it's still very, very rare. The next map here is the 1514, 1515 Ferducci. This map, so let me orient you a little bit here. Obviously, Cuba. These are the Florida Keys, which are very well represented. And look at that circle of dots there. That looks just like that circle of dots, doesn't it? That is the Tortugas. It is labeled the Tortugas. These are labeled the Martires, which is what they came to be known, the islands, the Martires. This is South Florida. These are probably the 10,000 islands here because Ponce de Leon in 1513, he came up to, he landed in Florida somewhere in Melbourne, most likely. That's Cape Canaveral there, came down the coast. And as we'll talk about in a little while, the second thing that he discovered, even though it was but the first thing that he really did discover before anybody else was the Gulfstream, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. He sailed right around the Florida Keys, right down here, He sailed to the Tortugas, where they took 160 turtles off the beach, and I think 16 sea wolves, which were Caribbean monk seals, which are now extinct. The last monk seal was seen off of Key West, I think, in 1922. Came up here to right near Sanibel in his first voyage, and then returned to Cuba. Again, another portolan style on vellum. Only one of these exists. Next chart we're going to look at is a very interesting chart. In this chart, this map seals the name America. It's right here, and it's not in North America. You call North America Florida, Tierra Florida. It's in South America. Florida is now shown as part of the continent. It's not obvious from here whether it was not known whether Florida was part of something larger, but by this time, by 1540, we know that Florida is part of a much larger landmass. This references Verrazano's lands of discovery in the northern North America, in North America. That's a Spanish flag here in the Caribbean, Cuba, Hispaniola, and again we have America. We have the South America labeled as America. So this map pretty much sealed the fact that the New World was going to be known as America. Obviously, this is North America, South America. And it is separate from Asia now. Here's Asia. Here's Zipangu, that's Japan. We go back to this map here. Reusch originally did draw Cuba in here, and then he put this scroll on top of it to hide it because he didn't really know whether he was going to be accurate in describing that as an island or whether that was because there was information from Marco Polo, believe it or not, that said that Japan and Cuba were essentially located in the same place. The next map is of 1562 Gutierrez and Koch. If you go to the Mel Fisher Museum, you'll see a representation of this entire map. There's only a couple of copies of this that exist in the world. I have a portion of the map, which is over here, which this image is taken from. You can see here, again, is they still have the Tropic of Cancer above Cuba. It's actually well below Cuba where it exists. It is the first printed map to name where we are right now, the Martiles or Martires. Tortugas is named. Both of those are new names to the world. This map was printed in Antwerp. It is this is just a section of a very large map. And I only have one section of it, and there's only one other map like this. There's only two complete copies. And this is the only one that exists outside of institutions right now. So where did the name Martyrs come from? So martyrs was the original name. So the name came from the Indians. So southeastern United of Florida was populated by the Tequesta, and the southwest Florida was populated by the Calusa, King Carlos. Carlos, the Calusa actually dominated the Tequesta, and they were subjects of the Calusa, and they would war against the Tequesta all the time. So the keys were called in the Indian language, they were called places of suffering. So the Indian guides that Ponce de Leon had expressed that to him, and they translated that into the Martyr Keys, places of suffering, which obviously they are not today, which is thankful, right? Here's the Bahamas. These are probably Quesal, that's Andros, Cuba obviously down here. So we're just taking you through the chronology of all the maps up to the current time. This map dates from 1591. It is drawn by Jacques Lemoyne. He was part of the original Huguenot expedition to America that settled first in just north of St. Augustine. So the Matanzas River is named after the massacre of the French by the Spanish when they tried to establish a settlement in Florida just north of St. Augustine. They first settled in 1562, abandoned it, came back in 1564, and were routed out by the Spanish. It is so Lemoyne, as you would expect from the name, is French. You can certainly see a different style here of map. Florida takes a different shape. This is now on copper plate versus woodcut. It is the first map that we've seen that shows a lot of interior features, so lakes and mountains and things that don't necessarily exist, but they're shown. Interior here, this is Andros here. That's Bimini. It's named Bimini. These are the Martires. It's named Martires. And obviously there's some nice sea monsters in this beautiful map. That map is actually right here, and it is in Debris' book. So this is an uncolored copy of that map dating from 1591. So this is the Dutch map. This is from Delay. He was a member of the Dutch West India Company. So the original, all of these maps up until this time were done just without any real. They were all done by memory. They were all done without any surveys. They were all done without any hydrology, without any soundings, without just very roughly done. So starting in the early 1600s, we had more technology, or cartographers had more technology available to them. So the map is titled Florida. Florida is, though, labeled as Tequesta for the Tequesta Indians that lived on the southeast corner here. This is the best representation of Florida in the early 1700s. There's a big compass rose here, rum lines going off. These are typical courses that sailors would sail. It's a very classic style of sea chart for the time. And it was published by Delay, who again was part of the Dutch West India Company, which obviously did trading with the New World and was most interested in sea charts. So it was made as a sea chart. So this is the Blauw from 1634. This really begins the Dutch dominance and influence in charting, which went all the way through the 1600s. It's the first sea chart of the New World to use the Mercator projection. So the Mercator projection is still used today for current NOAA charts that we all look at. Same projection, same way that you project a round world onto a flat surface. It's another Portolan style. So you can see there's place names on all these locations on the shoreline. This is a sea chart. So they're all interested in the sea, not so much the land. There's a Spanish herald here for the Spanish. The names are added, but English and the Dutch. So the Dutch purchased New York in 1626 from the Indians, as you may recall. So this references the Dutch ownership of New Amsterdam, which is shown right up here. That's the Cape here. New York is right here. It says New Amsterdam right there. The keys are shown here. They're labeled the Martyrios, the Tortugas is labeled. Florida is obviously taking a little bit different shape. The Bahamas, Cuba is pretty well defined by then as an island for sure. Then we get into the Dudley from 1647. The Dudley map is over there. It's a very unusual style of map. This was part of the of Dudley's Secrets of the Sea. It was he was the first Englishman to produce an atlas. So there are maps of the entire world in the original atlas. He was the illegitimate son of the Earl of Leicester. The important things about this map, so obviously this is the south tip of Florida. The Tortugas are named right here. There's actually, you can't see it here, but there's an anchor right here, which shows the anchorage in the Tortugas. That's labeled the Martyrios there. But some of the interesting things about this map are that it includes magnetic variation, shows it 7 degrees right there. So this is one of the first charts that starts to recognize magnetic variation, which is the variation that exists on the face of the earth based on magnetic deviation that exists naturally, and it changes, as we all know. This is a copper plate. It was printed in Florence, Italy. It's a beautiful map, and there are a whole series of these maps that exist. This is the Dutch map. This is derived from the Dutch West India Company as well. This is the Roggeveen. It was designed to be used at sea, so it's very rare. There aren't too many copies of this map either. The Martyrios are shown over here. References Cayo Tabanos, which is horsefly K, actually, in Spanish. It's printed in the Netherlands. Again, the Dutch continue to dominate the charting of the New World through most of the 17th century. It's copper plate, beautiful map, beautiful cartouche. It's called a cartouche up here. This is another Dutch map from 1684 that's a Van Kuylen. So one of the reasons I wanted to show you this map is it's titled Florida. At this time and throughout this whole period of mapping, there was never any north up convention. East is up here, north is over here, right? That was very common. There are the Tortugas are here. This is the Florida Keys here, South Florida. They are named Martyrios and Tortugas. So obviously this passage here between Florida and Cuba was very important to especially the Spanish. That's where most of the wealth from the New World passed. This is called the New Bahama Channel. I'll show you another map that has the old Bahama Channel in it and how that was figured, how Alaminos figured that out. He was Ponce de Leon's navigator, his pilot. One of the other things that's interesting about this map is it's one of the first maps to have depth soundings, just like the Dudley map here. So as you would see on a new map here, these are all depth soundings. So it has variation, depth soundings. It's very technologically up to date for the time. And this week, now we're at, this is an English map printed in London by Seller and Price. They were one of the earliest map producers. It's titled The Bahamas and the Windward Passage. Here's Florida, Florida Keys, Martyrios, Tortugas are shown right here. It is the first map to reference Key West. There's a little island here, and it says Keygost, Keygost. It's the first map that you'll see that references anything about Key West. Throughout the 1700s, it was known as Keygost or Kiowesso or Bone Island, lots of different references to Key West. And it does reference early Spanish and Dutch names. The Martyrs, again, and the Tortugas are located and shown on the map. And this, now we're getting 1755. So this represents what the Spanish, so Thomas Lopez was one of the most famous Spanish map makers of the time. And again, as you remember from our earlier discussion, the Spanish didn't produce a lot of printed maps. They didn't distribute maps outside of Spain. They were held as national secrets. So this is one of the few representations of Florida that's in a Spanish map, and it exists 1755. So you can see Florida doesn't look much like you and I, like it looks on a map of today, and it actually doesn't even look like it does on English maps or Dutch maps. Very primitive. So the Spanish controlled Florida from 1513, when Ponce de Leon supposedly discovered it, to 1763, when they lost it to the English in the French and Indian War. So this is what the Spanish thought Florida looked like. They never mapped it. They never surveyed it. They had very little interest in Florida. There were never any Spanish settlements in Florida other than St. Augustine, permanent settlements, other than St. Augustine and Pensacola. There was a brief settlement in a place called Tequesta near Miami for just a few years that was Spanish. But Florida didn't have any pearls, didn't have any gold, didn't have any silver, didn't have the things that the Spanish conquistadors were looking for. So Florida was really ignored. It was never settled by the Spanish. So when the British captured Havana in 1762 and 1763, they decided to trade Cuba to give it back to Spain in exchange for Florida. So this is what Spain thought Florida looked like. And we'll go here. This is what the English thought Florida looked like in 1763, in that same period of time. This is from William Roberts' book called An Account of the First Discovery and Natural History of Florida. It was really a document to try and promote colonization of Florida by the British. It represents the state of the English knowledge of Florida and the Keys that was acquired from Spain, because there weren't any English maps. Even Dudley's map was Italian up until that time. But you can see the Florida Keys here, which look a little bit better than they do in some of the Spanish maps, the Tortugas, the New Bahama Channel, or the Gulf of Florida here. So this is what the English thought they started with. So the English didn't know much about the Florida Keys or Florida. They had already lost the HMS Lou in 1744 and Fowey in 1749, which ended up being the names for the reefs, obviously Lou Key Reef and Fowey Rocks. And we're getting ready, getting ready to lose the Carysfort. There should be an S there, which they lost on Carysfort Reef in 1770. I go back to this map, though. I have this atlas here. So a lot of these maps, most of these maps appeared in atlases. Virtually every one of these maps came in an atlas, a book, just like you would buy an atlas of maps today. And some of them were printed separately, but most of them. So this is the Bishop here, which is very interesting. I just wanted to show it to you. This is an English map. This is another representation of Florida by the English from 1761. What's interesting here, you can't see it very well, but there's a line running right here through inside of the reef. The reef is out here. These are the Florida Keys. Here's the Tortugas. That's actually, I think, labeled the Marquesas. These are the Tortugas. But it shows that this was the line, the tract that the Spanish took to Havana. So Spanish were smart enough from the beginning. When Ponce de Leon rounded the Keys, he came inside the reef. It's believed he came inside the reef. And the Spanish who came to Havana, and there was a lot of traffic between St. Augustine, they came inside the reef too, inside Hawks Channel as well. So the Spanish didn't know what Florida looked like. The English didn't know what Florida looked like. So the first thing they did was hire this guy de Brom, otherwise known as the Odd Being, because he was an odd being. He was sent back to England because he was so odd. But in the 6 years that he was here, he did tremendous surveys. He was the first surveyor in North America to have Harrison's chronometer. So many of you have probably seen Dava Sobel's, read her book, Longitude. Maybe you know about that. But he actually could map longitude very, very precisely because he had one of the first Harrison's chronometers, which was developed in England as a consequence of the Longitude Prize that was given by the British government. So de Brom's was appointed the Surveyor General of East Florida. So Florida was divided into East Florida and West Florida. West Florida was under the control of a guy named, from a cartographic perspective, from a guy named Bernard Romans, who's another unusual character. In East Florida by de Brom, who was actually a German. This map was printed before this map, so I'm trying to stay chronologically. So this map is awfully interesting. Nobody could ever really figure out why the hell he drew this map, because it's called The Ancient Tequesta and the Promontory of East Florida. So what this map depicts, these are the Florida Keys here. What this map depicts is Florida in the Ice Age. But why would he do that? So what happened in 1766, right after the English traded Cuba for Florida, the Spanish governor of Havana was issuing permits to Cuban fishermen to come to the northern Keys. The Spanish essentially claimed the Florida Keys as being part of Cuba. So de Brom drew this map to refute the claim of Spain to the ownership of the Florida Keys by proving in his own way that the Keys were geologically part of Florida, and that when the sea level was much lower, we were part of a much larger landmass. The Spanish were never successful in forwarding their claim to the Florida Keys, but they had their own maps drawn by a guy named Manuel de Rueda, and he labeled the Florida Keys as the Northern Keys. So it's a little interesting bit of history. Spanish also claimed Quesal Bank, which is 50 miles to the east of us, as late as the 1950s, if you may remember. They invaded it, Quesal, in the 1950s. It's more interesting history. So this is all English now. We're into the English period. The English only controlled Florida for 20 years before they lost it again as a consequence of the Revolutionary War. But they did more in terms of mapping Florida and the Florida Keys in those 20 years than the Spanish did in the 250 preceding years. And this is de Brom's 1772 map of the Florida Keys. I didn't bring it with me. It's part of de Brom's book called the Atlantic Pilot, which also includes what is the first map of the Gulfstream, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It took DeBrom 6 years to perform all his surveys and soundings. This is the most accurate map chart of the Florida Keys that existed. It came with a series with a book, sailing instructions to tell people how to sail around the Florida Keys through the new Bahama Channel. And again, he had the use of Harrison's chronometer to be able to make all these maps and make them extremely accurate. So this, and I brought that map with me. It's the biggest one over there. This is the 1789 Norman. This is the first map produced in America after the American Revolution of our part of the world. It does locate the Martyrs Isles. We're still called the Martyrs Isles, Martyr Reef, and Hawks Channel. So it is a very interesting map in itself. This is the Gauld. It's on the front of my book. It's a wonderful map, beautiful map, published posthumously by Faden. He was the hydrographer to the king. And the Gauld maps represent the best maps of Florida, and they were used actually all the way through the 1800s. They were pirated by Edmund Blunt of Boston, who produced maps for Americans. He sold his company to the U.S. government in 1867, and that ultimately became NOAA, U.S. Geodetic Survey, and today what we know as NOAA. A beautiful map, very accurate. You can see, obviously, the Florida Keys here. This is the new Bahama Channel. This is the old Bahama Channel. This is Coldwell Banker, Santorin Channel, Nicholas Channel, Bahamas. So what's the reason they called this the old Bahama Channel is that's the way all the treasure used to go before they found the Gulfstream, started to use the Gulfstream as a conduit, a seaway to get back to the New World. And that only happened, that didn't happen until the mid 1500s, early 1500s. And Alaminos, he was the pilot for Ponce de Leon, and he was the one who discovered the Gulfstream, and he was the first one to start to use the Gulfstream to get back to Spain. So most of the treasure fleet from South America and Central America came together in Havana, and they came through right here. So all the New World wealth came right by our front door for a couple hundred years. So that's why all the wrecks are out there. That's why it's such an interesting historical place. So we can't really talk about the Keys and the mapping of the Keys without talking about the Gulfstream, which is 3 miles that way. So you guys have probably heard this before, but it's when you really think about it. So there is more water that flows by our front door every day, every minute, every hour than flows through all the rivers in the entire world. It's unbelievable. There's that much water out there flowing all the time. More flowing right by our front door than the combined flow from every river in the entire world. It's amazing, isn't it? And we take it for granted to a certain degree. Many of you are probably familiar with this painting, 1899 Winslow Homer, titled The Gulfstream. What you probably don't know about it, which I didn't know about until I started really taking a look at it. Here's the name port on the back. It says Anna, Key West. So this dismasted fishing sloop with this fisherman there's been many articles written about this painting and what it means. There's sharks in the water. Here's a ship over here. He doesn't get saved by the ship, by the way, according to Homer. This funnel here, water spout, doesn't sink him. He actually survives, according to Homer. But this Homer probably sailed in a ship like that because he spent a number of winters in the Bahamas, in Nassau. So he actually experienced the Gulfstream. He painted this picture from his own experience. So if you've ever been out there in these kinds of conditions, it's pretty representative of what it's like. So we start with Homer. We're going to end up here with somebody else that you remember too. So this is probably the first representation in a map of the Gulfstream dating from 1534. That is a representation of the Gulfstream here. So there was this belief from Aristotle, and Aristotle started the theory of what's called prima mobile. And that really resulted in the quest for the Northwest Passage that existed for hundreds of years. I mean, how many sailors, the Franklin expedition, how many expeditions throughout history looked for the Northwest Passage and never found it. So the prima mobile is sort of obvious when you think about it. Aristotle says everything in the universe moves from the east to the west, right? Sun does, moon does, stars do, everything that we know about, and so did the ocean move from the east to the west. So that everybody said, well, if everything is moving from the east to the west, and based on the conservation of mass, if you pile up a bunch of water on the east coast of this new world, it's got to go somewhere, right? So that's where they figured there had to be an outlet for all that water that was moving from the east to the west. And that's why they believed there had to be a Northwest Passage or some passage between the east and the west. This map is from the Salviati Planisphere, which is Diego Rivera's map. He succeeded Sebastian Cabot as the pilot major in Spain. And it was reprinted here by Ramusio in 1534. This is the 1545 Medina, which shows the route of the Spanish treasure fleet using that, using the Gulfstream. Here you can see the ships. These are all ships here going around using the Gulfstream current to navigate back to Spain, and from Spain back to the New World. That was called the Vuelta in Spanish, and his book, Medina's book, was called The Art of Navigation, and it was one of the first navigation primers ever written. This is a wonderful map by another unusual character named Anastasius Kircher from 1665. It is the first representation of currents in the North and South Atlantic and also in the Pacific, and it's remarkably accurate. It is all based on his theory. I don't think he never came to the New World, but he shows the currents here. He even shows the current going into the Gulf of Mexico. This would represent the equatorial current here, the equatorial current, Pacific equatorial current. And so it was amazingly accurate given the fact that he was really had never experienced any of these currents himself. That dates from 1665. This is from 1699 Dampier. Dampier was a very interesting guy. He was a pirate, naturalist. He wrote a book called The Voyages and Descriptions. He was the first person to ever propose that ocean currents are caused by trade winds. And he wrote one of the first sailing directions for navigating the Gulf Stream. I'll read a little section for you here. It says, here's how he describes the Gulf Stream and the Florida Straits. The current passes altogether with great strength through the Gulf of Florida, which is the most remarkable Gulf in the world because it always sets very strong to the north. Yet near the shores of the Gulf, there are tides, especially on the Florida shore, and ships may pass which way they please if they are acquainted. So what he's talking about there is the countercurrent running along the reef, right? If you guys have been out there, you know there's a countercurrent that runs inside the Gulf Stream, which goes in the opposite direction. He goes on to say how you don't want to be out in the Gulf Stream when there's a north wind blowing. He obviously experienced it. Very interesting character, this guy, Dampier. So this goes back to our buddy, the odd being, Mr. DeBaum. This is arguably the first real map and description of the Gulf Stream from 1772. It shows the Gulf Stream coming all the way through the Gulf, around the Florida Keys, through the Atlantic, and then back again. He doesn't show the bottom portion of it here, but this is a very detailed description of the Gulf Stream. Comes with sailing instructions as well, which were published as part of the Atlantic pilot when he was shipped back to England. This is another very, very early map of the Gulf Stream. This is Benjamin Franklin, we all know, and his nephew, Folger, who was a whaling captain. Franklin at the time was living in Paris. He was the he was the postal. He was in charge of the post office in the New World. And he was trying to understand why packages coming from London to New York took longer than packages or mail from London to points farther up the coast along the northeast coast, because obviously they got into the Gulf Stream here, and those passages typically took 2 weeks longer. So his nephew produced this map for Benjamin Franklin. It was published by Franklin. It was actually published first in England in 1769 and 1770. I've never seen a copy of that. Obviously there are one or two around, but that was suppressed probably by Benjamin Franklin himself, because obviously the United States and Britain were at odds at that time, just before the Revolutionary War. This map was produced specifically in France, in Paris, to help our allies, the French, in the Revolutionary War, and that's why there are a fair number of copies available still today. This is another map of the Gulf Stream from 1787, produced by Thomas Pownall. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and this map was part of his treatise, The Nautical Observation on the Currents of the Atlantic, forming a hypothetical theorem. So the hypothetical theorem then was that you could, and it was forwarded by Williams, who was in fact the grandnephew of Franklin, that you could navigate the Gulf Stream by using a thermometer, because as we all know, the Gulf Stream is warmer than the surrounding waters. That's what Pownall was referring to. And that's what this map, which was included in Williams' treatise called the Thermometrical Navigation, proposed, was that you could have safe passage through the Gulf Stream using a thermometer. So this, we're getting towards the end here. This is the 1850 Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt, which many of you recognize the name. His name is actually attributed to the Peru Current, which is also known as the Humboldt Current. This is his map of the Gulf Stream as well from 1850. And then finally here we have the Maury chart. So Matthew Maury, he was the pathfinder of the sea, the father of modern oceanography. He collected everything he could from sea captains and compiled that data into creating his maps of the ocean, which the physics. So he he wrote a book called The Physical Geography of the Sea that has a chapter on the Gulf Stream, actually. So that, I think, is it. So if we have any questions.
I just wanted to let everybody know that we are selling copies of his book at a discounted rate for this evening only. If you'd like to purchase a copy and have it signed by him while he's here tonight, this is a special one-night only offer that we have. We do sell it in our gift shop, but we're offering a discount for this evening if you'd like to purchase a book and have him sign it. Thank you very much, Brian.
As a reminder, our next lecture is April 12th. We'll be having Bob Rich come and speak.